Thank you for joining. We actually asked a few other foundations to join this conversation with us today, and people were really hesitant to join the conversation. So maybe you can speak to what are people grappling with in the field?
Sure. I think it's been a really interesting time in philanthropy. I think there are a number of people as individuals who hold the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion and racial justice in their personal lives in certain ways, and some who have long considered that a part of their philanthropy, and others who have not necessarily considered that to be part of their philanthropic work or philanthropic journey. And what I've noticed is that with a lot of the action and activation of people, of voices in the field, of the Black Lives Matter movement and other kind of advances in racial justice work, there's a lot of discussion in philanthropy and in nonprofits that I think is bringing the conversation forward to a lot more funders. And so a lot of our partners, I think, are looking inward at their own foundations and practices and outward at their grant making strategies to think about if they want to do more or shift their priorities.
Great. And Randy and Becca, are there any challenges that you saw along the way working with the foundations you're with?
I mean, absolutely. I think one of the things I saw was, again, us in the field were sort of inundated with this language, and I noticed when my board would try to participate in certain things that it was a little bit too much all at once. And it was also, I think, again, they fund in like food and health, and in some ways those systems are broken for everyone, and they wanted to fix it for everyone. And sometimes they'd be in these conversations where the focus was really on racial inequities and disparities, overly so, in a way that actually was a turnoff for them initially. Like they just felt like, but the system is broken in general, and it was hard for them to sort of engage in the conversation that was just beyond where they were at. So again, not that they didn't have those values or that they didn't think that it was important to fix those things. It was just not where they were at in the conversation. So I think sometimes the field is a little bit ahead, or even can be a little bit overly focused on things and not bring boards along on those conversations. So it just took longer for them to grapple with those issues and figure out what it looked like for them to engage in the racial equity and racial justice conversation and how to incorporate it into the work that they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I very similarly to Becca, I think our foundation, so one, and I mentioned this in our earlier conversation around, in 2019, we had a DE&I retreat that was led by our staff, and the work had started, and we started talking about these things. And to Becca's point, I think, while we may agree about certain things, folks have their own lived experiences and points of view. And I think being a new board member who also was a practitioner in this space, we've been really having conversations around, okay, yes, this is, our strategic framework and what we believe in. And is this the right direction for us? Like, how do we even double click on it and say, how do we go farther and ask ourselves questions that maybe we haven't before, or asking ourselves again, right? Like, is this the right answer? So I think it's, about, to Becca's point, like, how are we moving forward together? But I also think, we have to do that. Every foundation is its own entity, right? So how do you do that in a way that's organic to kind of your organizational structure, your board structure, and so it can't just be a cut and paste, but it's more about how do you move along in the way that's right for you, and that's what we've kind of been grappling with.
Yeah, that really resonates, I think, with some of the things I've been seeing across a number of different foundations. And kind of to your question, Claire, about what are the challenges or barriers, I think you both lifted up some of them. I think some of them can come from a question of donor intent, right? The world is a different place than when some of our foundations were started. And so what were the values that the donor held? What was the landscape? And, it's kind of like constitutional interpretation. Don't envy the Supreme Court for having decided these things. And we are all doing that as well in foundations of like, what was intended then? What does that how do we map that onto today's realities? And so I think that's one piece of the equation, and sometimes a stumbling block for foundations. I think others can be like just these topics can be very politicized. And so when there are either political or ideological differences among board members or family members, sometimes it's uncomfortable to even go there. And so I think a lot of folks are hesitant to bring the subject of race and racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion into their boardrooms if it hasn't been there before. And I think, I think relatedly, and both kind of in the room and publicly, people are also concerned about saying the wrong thing and doing the wrong thing, even if it comes from the right place and from good intentions. And I think finally, there's a final kind of barrier, which is just where to start. This is like such a huge topic. There's so many places to go. I think, especially in grant making, there are big foundations, Ford Foundation, other foundations that have been doing this work for a long time, are really thoughtful about it, have whole teams of people doing it. They have language on their website. And so it feels like there's such a huge gulf from like here to there, and really intimidating to get started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more, the myriad of ways that you could get started or to deepen the work in this space. Do you have a list of sort of the high level bucket areas that we could start with?
What we found is that there are these kind of different categories of places where foundations can start there to get active or more active or deepen their engagement. And what's interesting is that it does seem that different foundations are starting in different places. So it's not really a linear 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, but really like what's the most comfortable and accessible first step, or window into learning, and then it can go into other areas as appropriate. So just to explain what these mean a little bit, we talked before about the held values. So there's individual, as an individual, do you hold values that relate to these ideas? Also, as a board, have you espoused those values? Have you articulated them and said that this is part of what drives your foundation business and grant making? And in some cases, in a lot of cases, that is a good place to start, to also make sure there's alignment. Another piece of that early work might be working on language. So we have the values, but are we all hearing and saying the same thing when we use these words? And aligning on what they mean in context, in kind of current day context, historical context, and grant making context. And so I think, going deep into that space would look like kind of having active alignment on vocabulary that is shared and used across the foundation, the board, the staff, and partners, that has kind of preferred language for internal and external communications around diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial justice. Then I think another piece is an active learning agenda, saying, having some learning questions, some research questions, setting an intention for the year or a couple of years to say, these are the things that we would like to know more about, and making time in board meetings or site visits or newsletters, other things, discussion, like book clubs, discussions about engaging in the field, and kind of some general materials or specific to philanthropy. Grant making priorities is where a lot of foundations start. They say, let's put our money where our values are. And so, working racial justice, diversity, equity, inclusion into the grant making in terms of the what is funded, in terms of funding organizations that are doing work that explicitly include moving the needle on DEI or racial justice, in terms of reducing disparate impacts in society on oppressed groups, dismantling structures of racist or oppressive policies, practices, systems, changing societal norms, changing policies and systems. Those are the kinds of investments that a foundation might be making, which is also related to grant making practices, and thinking about the ways that the process is accessible to organizations representing different communities, to leaders of color and leaders who have proximity to the communities that they're serving, making sure that they are aware of and invited into the process, and receiving an equal opportunity, even if their organizations maybe have not been as well resourced as others in the past, thinking about how that might play into the evaluation process and the kinds of investments that the foundation would want to make. And also just thinking about, when there are a lot of kind of process hoops to jump through, what are the organizations that are going to struggle with that the most, or maybe not have the resources to go through the process, and how can we streamline some of that so it doesn't create a barrier?
Thanks, Laurel. Randy and Becca, each of your foundations took a slightly different approach to this and started in different places. We're going to dive deeper into each foundation story in a minute, but can you just give us a little preview of the approaches that each of you took to start?
In 2019, we had and this preceded my time as a board member, our DE&I retreat. And I think the Summerfield Foundation has a long history of really having personal relationships with our grantees, right? And when I say that, meaning really getting to know the individuals, the leaders, the participants as much as possible, to really have a robust and comprehensive understanding of our support and how we can best support them. And so I think, and I'll kind of hit on the point that Laurel mentioned about governance, being a new board member, that was also a big turn. I think the last new board member we had was 10 years ago, I want to say. And so there were two members, myself and one other person who's also a practitioner. And I really give a lot of credit to our staff and our board for really welcoming us in. I'm sure Becca can attest to this. Is not always easy when you have, new board members and different turnover. And I think that our foundation did it really well. And if we can think about those boxes that Laurel showed, there was the white space in between. I view that as the connective tissue, and I want to call it trust and building a safe space. And I think even before we delve into those boxes, from my perspective, joining the foundation, I felt like that was what we really focused on around this time, because, racial justice, when we talk about it, it's difficult, right? And when we can't think about that without thinking about our own identities. And I think that in order to have a learning agenda, to talk about governance and grant making, we have to start with us. We have to start with who we are as a collective. And so I think where we've really been focused the past year, and obviously we're doing those things, but I think we've made really doubled down on building trust around one another and really bringing up key issues that we may have thought, hey, we've talked about this before and this is why we do this, but really questioning again, hey, maybe, we should look at it this way or think about it this way. And so some of that has been an internal process, but we've also invited, external experts to learn from them and learning from our grantees, right? And I think our staff has done a phenomenal job of going out into the field and asking questions, and kind of helping that inform us. And so it's building trust with one another. And I would say we've maintained the trust, but I'm even going to throw something out there and say reestablishing trust with our grantees around this space and ensuring that we are supporting them in the way that is meaningful to them.
Thanks. It's so important that everybody can see themselves in the work and has a place, and that we all trust and take care of the community, including ourselves within it. And Becca.
So I think that the Sampson Foundation came from a little bit of a different direction. So I think we actually started our journey because we were funding in areas where there's intersectionality. And so even though there was no direct intent, like we're going to go out and we want to like have this equitable focus, or we want to like change the world in that way, because we were funding in areas where there are health disparities, where the impacts of, you know, dirty energy are felt more prominently by certain groups of people. That sort of raised this awareness for the board, because we were, you know, so without the intention, they still were sort of exposed to some of the issues and language. And then also, interestingly enough, they kind of started with impact investing, which is like usually really late in the game, but because they just felt really passionate about, we don't want to only give our 5%, like how do we use the rest of our portfolio? And some of the ways that the easiest ways to do that without having a professional staff member that all they do is like think about PRIs. Some of the easiest ways were just to like fund in under-resourced communities and fund, you know, at CDFIs and things. So we kind of started a little bit backwards, and really we didn't embrace the language and those pieces and the intentionality until the last year.
Really helpful to see both the two case studies and to hear the high level overview that Laurel gave of what's happening across various foundations in the field. We appreciate having this conversation with each of you. Maybe tell us a little bit about the Selene Summerfield Foundation and your role with the foundation.
Well, I feel honored to be a member of the board. Mr. Summerfield had a history of philanthropic giving, and he believed in supporting young people, specifically boys that from underserved backgrounds, that they could go to college, get a good education, and be successful in their lives. And we know that since then, that vision has kind of expanded to meet the needs of underserved and underrepresented groups. And we know that that is in alignment with Mr. Summerfield's vision. And he initially started by naming the foundation or creating the foundation in honor of his father, who was a law professor at the University of Kansas. And kind of that first philanthropic stream was vis-a-vis setting up the Summerfield Scholars, which has been an ongoing program since 1929. So I'm honored as a board member to support Mr. Summerfield's legacy of supporting young people as they approach the post-secondary world and career.
Yeah, it is a long-standing history, and it's been interesting to see as the executive director of the foundation how it's evolved over the past decade, really, and even prior to that, it's always taken on different iteration as the foundation has gone through the past 90 or so years, but really held fast to donor intent in terms of that education piece, and that being an important part of the trajectory of people's lives, really. So, and tell us just a bit about your background in terms of your work experience and what was valuable in terms of bringing that knowledge to bear on the board now.
No, so I'm originally from New York. I went to an HBCU, Wilberforce University in Ohio. And I always share that because it was instrumental in kind of how I viewed the world, also as a Black person, right? Being able to attend a historically Black university. And I started working in corporate America right after college. Great experience, a lot of transferable skills, but I was still trying to find that passion that I had. So I always like to say that the work found me. I didn't find the work. And that first kind of initial, I think what hooked me, I became a high school teacher in inner city Miami at Miami-Jackson High School. And it was just a great experience for me. And I'm not going to sit here and say I was the best teacher, right? But my students were the best students. And I learned so much from them. And from there started working in different nonprofit organizations. Year Up is one of them. I also worked for CUNY, the City of the University of New York College System, which is a network of 25 colleges. I had the fortunate opportunity to serve on the launch and implementation team of its newest community college, Gutman Community College, which was a great experience. Worked in philanthropy for the James and Judith Diamond Foundation and the organization for which they provided the seed funding, Here to Here. And also most recently, a national nonprofit organization, Co-op Careers, which helps first-generation college graduates overcome underemployment through digital skills and peer connections. And I served as the chief operating officer. So really helping them expand and deepen their footprint in the cities that they're in. And they recently expanded to Los Angeles and soon to be Chicago, actually in 2 weeks. So, and currently and this is recent within the past 2 months, started as the foundation president for the CD&R Foundation, which is Clayton, Dubilier and Rice, which is a global private equity firm located in New York City and London. And our goal is to support creating equity through employment opportunity. Fantastic. And so all of these experiences, I think, have helped to shape the way that I view the world, the way that I feel that historically underrepresented and underserved groups need our support. This is why I don't say charity. I think it's the work we need to be doing. So I prefer the term philanthropy or philanthropic engagement. And the Summerfield Foundation, as you mentioned, Claire, has a long history of doing that. And I feel that I'm able to support in those ways.
Yeah, I love that. I think, going back to the root of philanthropy and the love of humankind, as the definition of the actual term, is so important. And it's a bit the ethos of how the Summerfield Foundation has approached this work, is that starting with love, really.
Love that.
So let's back up a little bit in terms of what the foundation did. And some of this was before your time of joining the board. We had long held values that were related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, going back to that love of humankind. And we did a retreat with a DEI consultant back in 2019, I think, with the board and staff. And that helped give us a common language and an understanding so that we could both understand as individuals where we were on our journey and how we came into this work. And then also and how we related to others in the space, and then helped us to start building a common language and start thinking about the frameworks within which we were working. Mm-hmm. And from there, we started looking at our grant making, our governance, and our operations to see how we could really embed diversity, equity, and inclusion values and principles into our work across everything that we were doing. Mm-hmm. And then, as you know, as a part of an entire succession planning process that took a few years, that culminated in bringing on 2 new board members in 2020. And that were yourself and Cindy, so both very experienced professionals in philanthropy with a lot of knowledge of post-secondary education, which is our focus area, a lot of knowledge about New York City and the ecosystem that is in the city that we're working within. So from there, with that brief sort of history, coming into this role as a new board member, which we hadn't brought on new board members for over a decade prior to this, what pieces of that work do you feel like really set the new board up, that collective group up for success?
Yeah. Wow. Well, first of all, it's an honor, right, to have been selected and alongside someone like Cindy, as you said, who has a long track record, longer than mine, in doing this work. And so just that is an honor to do that and to be able to work with yourself, Claire, as our executive director. And then just the other board members, right, who really just were very embracing. And I think that's the piece too, as you mentioned. If you haven't, had a new board member, right, in 10 years, that process can be daunting. So first, I want to give credit and accolades to the pre-existing board members, because it is not only hard to come to that decision to do so, but then to actually engage in it. And so I don't want to take that lightly. And that I'm just really humbled by that and honored to be a part of it. I think that because of that, that openness and that willingness to accept me for the experiences that I have, who I am as an individual, and I mean that holistically, is very, very evident. And so I think that to me is the number one step, or the foundational or fundamental element that has allowed me or enabled me, one, to feel comfortable being on the board, and two, that my voice matters. And, you know, I can't speak for Cindy, but I'm sure she would say something similarly. And so that's number one. And then number two, I think the way that that our board members have been, or board meetings have been structured, everything that we talk about, we speak about it comprehensively. And I love what you said, Claire, about it starting with love. And when we talk about the communities we serve both as a collective and as individual members, it is about love. And it's important also that we educate ourselves on the issues, many of them long-standing issues, as long as our history, as our country has been around, have existed. We need to talk about those. And so I want to commend the board for not shying away from those issues. And as you mentioned, the work started prior to everything that happened in 2020. So those are just a few tidbits that I think is important to share.
Great. Are there any specifics from the board meetings in terms of how they're set up, or learning opportunities that we've had that really resonated with you, or you felt were important for the group as a whole?
100%. So a few things. So one, the way that we open our meetings, as I mentioned, right, we're a human-centered organization that is focused on the communities that we serve. And we always start with a theme or a topic that honors those communities. And so one example is, each board member did a little research to find out the indigenous land that they currently reside on. Mine is the Lenape people. And this another thing we did kind of an in-depth assessment and learning on redlining, and really looked at the communities we serve, how redlining still affects those communities, and kind of even a map of where our current grantee organizations reside, right? So being able to connect the current work we do to the historic inequity is super important. And those are ways that we start our meeting off. So I feel like that helps to ground us in what we're doing. Another thing that I love are our grantee spotlights. Really hearing from, uplifting, and embracing our leaders. And I've heard this from being in the space as a nonprofit leader myself. Sometimes you may be told what to do, as opposed to how can I meet you where you are and support your leadership. And I think that the Summerfield Foundation really wants our leaders to know that we do believe in them. And of course, we'll have advice and suggestions, and we can share best practices. But I think that leadership support is so important and is often forgotten, especially with everything that's happened the past year and a half. You look at how organizations have been stressed and strained, and not only are they trying to uphold a business, they're trying to uphold the communities that they serve in the work that they do. So that, I would say, is another way.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about the grant making side of things, because I think that's something that is applicable to everybody listening. In what ways have we supported our grantees on their own DEI journeys as a foundation? And are there other examples you can share about how we've maybe leaned into trust-based philanthropy and tried to make it as streamlined and easy as possible for grantees that you can speak to, particularly from being on that nonprofit side for part of your career?
Awesome, Claire. I'm glad you asked, and I'm smiling because I think these things are so important. So one, and I'm glad you brought up trust-based philanthropy, multi-year grants. leaders in the nonprofit space are always trying to secure funding. And I think that's one less headache that they have to worry about. Also, core operating, right? We trust you. We know that you know what needs to get done. And so, kind of, providing those multi-year grants and, putting it under the umbrella of core operating, we know that we're able to support you in the things that you need to get done as a leader. Also, we've had a more intentional focus on leaders of color and women, really looking at, because there is inequity there. And one personal example I'll share quickly. I was a part of a group of nonprofit leaders and founders of color. And can I tell you, Claire, the level of despair that was shared amongst the group when it came to fundraising was just so alarming. And I know it's something I shared with you and with our board, but I think foundations right now have a real opportunity to hone in there and realize that, that they do need our support. And it is okay to have a specific focus on those groups. And I think that is one way when it comes to our grants that we've kind of elicited a little bit more focus.
Yeah. And we've also provided some small grants for organizations that are looking to do either training or bring in a consultant or to build out some sort of DEI related curriculum for their organization to support them in that way, which seems to be what we've heard, a very underfunded area of the work.
Yes. And on that piece too, thank you for bringing that up. I think almost treating our grantees as a learning community. And so I know one of the things that we did was kind of assess from them, hey, what do you need? What things do you feel like you know or you can share a best practice? And I think that that's something that's important too, because, this is a time where we really need to all lock arms. And sometimes I may have something that doesn't require, any monetary allocations, but it can just be kind of a knowledge exchange. So that piece has always been great as well.
Right. Yeah. So what I'm hearing too from what you're saying, Randy, is that it's not just about either what you're funding, it's also about who you're funding and how you're funding. So that relationship approach, there's a variety of different ways that you can step into this space really meaningfully without necessarily changing up your board or doing some of the big, multi-year journeys that the Summerfield Foundation has done. Can you maybe start us off just by telling us a little bit about the Sampson Foundation and your role?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Sampson Foundation was founded in 1993, and the family's based out of Pittsburgh. So all the initial grant making was based out of Pittsburgh as well. And after Mr. Sampson's passing in 2007, when his daughters and wife took over, they shifted the focus of the foundation to health and wellness. So they, for many years, funded all things food related, nutrition and farming, and then also integrative medicine. So that was the focus for quite a few years. And then in 2017, they also added some environmental funding into their portfolio as well. And I serve as the executive director. I've been working with them since 2012 and have helped shape a lot of, the changes that have happened since then.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the changes that have happened during your time and how does DEI fit into all of this?
Yeah, so I think the Sampson Foundation is an interesting case study. One, they're a really small board, so they only have 3 board members, which is a little different. And also, I think their journey didn't start in the usual place. So, a lot of foundations, they start with sort of the conversation, like how do we talk about equity and race and privilege, and that can get sticky, right? And so that can kind of be the first sticking point. And with the Sampson Foundation, they kind of came in from the other end of the spectrum. So really, when we added the environmental grant making which was in 2017, I think that was actually the first time that we started hearing some of these terms because we were looking into organizations that consider themselves environmental justice organizations. So we started thinking about the impact of, for instance, in Pittsburgh, the energy sector is huge, right? So the coal and fracking is a huge industry there, and the impact on people is not equitable, obviously. So who makes the money from those industries is not equitable, and who suffers the consequences of those industries is also not equitable. And so that was kind of the first exposure, I think, a little bit to some of the language, but still we weren't really talking about it as a foundation. And the other thing that was interesting was the board was really interested in impact investing. And where that took us, in addition to doing some green energy funding within our portfolio, our investments, not funding grants, but like investment funding, we also looked at location specific funding. So they funded these projects that were based in certain zip codes or counties that were just around like equitable housing and things that they weren't doing in their grant making. And also I think that was like, that tends to be a later step for a lot of foundations, but for my board, they were really excited to use that other 95% to do something besides just build up the traditional investment sector. And so we still weren't using any of the language that, you know, we associate with DEI, but I think they were already showing that their values really aligned in that way. So that was kind of their starting point. And we really didn't start doing like speaking about it or thinking about tracking who was served or some of these questions around like leadership of organizations until 2020. And so that was kind of the next stage, but it was a little bit backwards from where a lot of foundations go.
So when did all of this start in terms of the impact investing and the PRIs and those starting conversations? How many years ago was that?
So it all started around similar time frame, because when we went into the environmental, when we added environment to our grant making portfolio in 2017, it's pretty short after that. Like by 2018, we were doing environmental investments within our investment portfolio. And so that led to some of these other conversations. And we did our first PRI at the very beginning of 2019. Which was to actually a national organization. What that one wasn't local, called the Reinvestment Fund, which works on food access and security, and a whole host of other issues. But because they had an interest in that area, they invested in that PRI specifically.
Got it. And tell us a little bit more about who has supported you and the board along this journey. I know you're a small staff foundation and a small board. So how did you get the resources in terms of the time and the people knowledge to do these initiatives?
That is a great question, because I really wish we had more support, to be honest. I think that is one of the challenges of being a small foundation, a small staff. Our investment advisor was tremendously helpful with that piece of it in terms of vetting opportunities through CDFIs, vetting the green energy funds, even vetting or doing an analysis of when we got to that point of who our investment managers were outside of our like point of contact at this firm. But in terms of the individual funds, they did an analysis for us in terms of race and gender and all of that on our managers. So they've been tremendously helpful. And I think I've actually relied a lot on the funder network that we've built in Pittsburgh and then our grantees themselves. So I often will just call the grantee and say, we're thinking about this, or I need an update, especially during 2020 with COVID and then with sort of this racial equity awakening and people suddenly feeling like urgent when they maybe hadn't been before about some of the issues around racial justice and feeling like, well, maybe we need to change the focus of the foundation. I was calling my grantees, being like, tell me who to talk to, connect me with someone. And that helped a lot, because we're not located as staff in Pittsburgh, and it's just me making those calls. So between our funder network and our grantees, that was where we would get a lot of information from.
That's great. And people were generally willing to share and help. Is there anything you did along the way to make it easy for them to help?
I mean, I do think we're a very trust-based funder, right? So we do a lot of general operating funding. We don't ask our grantees to jump through a lot of hoops. So I do think, and we've been building these relationships, for a decade in some cases. And we've always been highly communicative. So like communicative, we talk to them more than we just like collect paperwork. And so I think that helped, that foundation helped. And then I think also expressing that we're expanding our portfolio. So it's not like we're putting grantees in competition. Like if you refer me to someone, that's going to be less money for you. So I think that helps. I think honestly, the environment at Pittsburgh helps, because Pittsburgh is kind of one of these smaller cities where they're really close knit. And so they actually really want to help each other. They partner a lot. Like we would talk to one grantee and they would say, I have this great partner and we work together. And so it's not as competitive as maybe in like a larger city where the grant dollars you can feel like you're fighting over the same dollars.
Right. Awesome. And where are you now in terms of all of this work and what the foundation is doing? What's happening at this time?
So we're at a really exciting turning point. The board just approved this summer to begin our first participatory grant making process. So what that means is I'm in the recruiting process right now. So this is August. I know we'll be watching this in a couple months, but we are trying to recruit committee members for our first participatory grant making board, essentially. And they've allocated a budget to it, and they've chosen a sort of a broad focus area for it. And we're going to put that money in the hands of the community to distribute. And so that was one way that we found would bring more voices to the table. I think it was an easier step than actually adding board members, which just being a really small board is a little bit intimidating, and also not having the relationships where there's necessarily someone we're ready to bring on to the full, like the actual trustee board. But this way we're shifting power back into the community. We're building those relationships that could ultimately lead to something else. And we're allowing the community to really say, this is where we think funding should be directed. So we're really excited about that stuff.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. That also sounds like a big piece of work to be getting off the ground right now.
Yes. Again, I wish I had more support, but I will say, it is possible. And again, we've leaned heavily on our existing relationships. I've been distributing information and sort of a call for committee members to our close partners, saying, who would you recommend? Who would be great to do this work? And I'm sure it will be a big lift for the committee themselves, and we are compensating them. That was a big part of the plan, was making sure we compensate people for their time and expertise. So I hope I'll have more to share when this is live in 2 months, and I'll be able to say it's great and we've launched and it's going really well. We'll see. It is definitely building the plane while we're flying it. It's not super, we've done a lot of reading, but it's not the most common practice at this point. So, you are sort of trying to figure out how to make it work in your city with your resources in your funding area. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I'm looking forward to having more conversations about how that develops as this goes along. On the point of building the plane as you're flying it, do you feel like that's something that you've been doing all along? Are there places where you maybe went a little bit slower in the beginning and then sped up, or have you kind of had to figure it out as you go the whole time?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with DEI is like we hear the language a lot in terms of, if you're just like reading news, but also in our field, right? Every conference, there's always this language is around us, but our boards aren't necessarily exposed to it in the same way. So I think when you're on the journey with your own board, it's always going to be a unique experience, right? Because you have to figure out where they're at and how to align with their values and help this be a part of the implementation of their mission and values. And so, yeah, to some extent, I think you're always flying a little blind and trying to figure it out. But then again, there's also so many resources, right? From Exponent, other places that can help give like questions that are great starters for conversation, help frame out language, right? Even just giving people definitions, like starting with, we started last summer just looking at what's the definition of or how do you incorporate racial equity versus racial justice into your portfolio? And like, which of those definitions really resonates with the work that we want to do going forward and makes sense with, you know, the areas that we fund in. And so sometimes just finding definitions and giving people that. There's also, you know, curated reading lists and things like that that I've tapped into for sure. And then forwarded very select pieces to my board based on where we are in our journey and what I think will really help them and take the next step.
Great. Well, we're going to continue this conversation with some other funders in the mix. So thank you.